Hey, Jameson here, and today I want to talk to you about MVP. And MVP stands for Minimum Viable Product, and I just want to give you my take on it as far as building products and applications goes, because I think it's crucial to building an application and not getting sidetracked and building something that people don't want, which is the greatest strategy of product building as far as like being an entrepreneur goes. And also, if you work for someone else, then focusing on an MVP or a minimum viable product allows you to do less work, basically. If you can convince them that the feature set is smaller than it needs, or than the manager says it was originally, then you just have to do less work. So it's a win-win no matter what. Alright, and I have a different drawing thing here. We'll see how it goes. I'm using ink to draw. I thought it would be cool. Alright, so let me write this up here. And I do have to dip the brush quite a bit, but I think that it's like more legible and it makes me think more carefully about what I'm saying because I don't want to use up another sheet of paper. Alright, so MVP. Let's talk about each word individually. And by the way, a lot of people, they kind of are over this word. They think, MVP stands for just kind of a meaningless acronym, and I think that's because their interpretation of it is wrong. Because you really need all three words in order for it to mean something valuable. So let's talk about minimum first. Well, what do I mean by minimum? Well, so let's say that we'll draw a circle here. Let's say this is the feature space, or the set of all possible features which you could have. So maybe one of them might be a login button. Alright, that might be a feature. Okay, so there are all these different features in here. I'll just kind of represent them as little dots in here. Alright, and then what is MVP? Well, MVP is a subset of all of the possible features that your app can have. So when I say minimum, I mean a subset. So maybe it's these guys right here. Alright, so this outer circle is kind of like all. And then this inner circle is the minimum. Alright, makes sense? Okay, so we've covered minimum. We choose a subset of all of the possible features. And then viable. Viable means basically which of these features are necessary in order for your product to fulfill its users' needs. Now, if you're just building something for a company, like you're just working as an employee, you might not be thinking like this far, like you might not be very familiar with your customers' needs. You just do what your boss tells you to. And that's completely fine, but keep in mind that your company is still trying to achieve this. They're trying to build a product which achieves some sort of user need. Yeah, so the way you choose which ones go in this minimum part is you make sure that each of them are absolutely necessary in order to fulfill that user's need. Okay, so minimum, viable in terms of is it actually necessary in order to achieve the user's needs, and then product, that's just what you're building. That one's obvious. So hopefully that makes sense. For each product, it can be kind of hard to determine where this line is drawn. Like, maybe people start wanting to pull some of these in, like your project manager, or maybe if you're building this on your own, you think, well, this would be really nice if it were a part of the app. And all I can say is that you would be very surprised with how little features your app can have when you're actually building it for people that are desperate for your product. So, have you ever used a product where it wasn't built by like a huge company? You could tell it was just some dude or a couple dudes building this thing, and they didn't have a lot of customer support, their website maybe wasn't that fancy, but it solved your problem, chances are you still used it unless some bigger fish came along and then saw the same problem and then did a better job at it. But the key here is that as long as you fulfill the user's needs with these minimum set of features, they don't care like how pretty it is and how many extra features you have mentioned on your sales page. They care, does your minimum viable product solve their problem? That's what it comes down to, whether you're working as an entrepreneur or whether you're working for a company. That's what the MVP is all about. And like I said, when you're building something, this is great news for you because it means that instead of having to work on all the possible problems, by the way, if I drew this to scale, this all would actually be infinite. This goes out in all directions to infinity. And that's why this is a big problem if you don't understand it, because when you're building products, you should typically build them in versions. Like, you start out with the MVP, and then you bring that to the market, and then you test it with your users. Or if you're working for a company, you just build what your product manager says you need to build, and then you ship that out, and then you expand the MVP. So the MVP can grow larger over time. You can bring in additional features once you've published and tested the original version. Okay, so people sometimes use like versioning for this, like V1. So like V1 or V2. And that's just referring to different versions of the MVP. At least if they know what they're talking about, that's what it should mean. When you're building products, make sure you decide on this first so that you're actually able to complete something and give it to the users or publish it for your company. And if you don't do this, then what will end up happening is you start chasing all these different features and you kind of do a crappy job at all of them, and you probably will actually never finish your application. So, oh, and also another thing on this is when you're completing the MVP, you'll notice like a natural hierarchy or dependency graph between these features. So that's a fancy way of saying that maybe one feature in your application depends on another feature. So maybe this feature right here depends on that feature, so I'll just draw an arrow. And then maybe this feature depends on that feature. So an example might be maybe writing to the database, like user preferences, depends on having a login, which depends on having a like a login page. So like this is like the back-end login, this is like the front-end login. So it's just sometimes your features depend on each other. Sometimes you can build them like separately. Maybe I'll do a whole extra video on this, on like completing features. It's called like parallelization in order to build products faster. Yeah, I'll probably do a separate video on that. But for now, sufficeth to say that sometimes features depend on each other, and when you're thinking about your MVP, once you've narrowed down all the features, it'd be smart to figure out which ones need to be completed first. It should be fairly obvious, because if you try to build one, you'll be thinking, well, it's kind of hard to build this without that. So that part's not too bad. But a lot of people don't understand this, and they build kind of monstrosity applications. They think they need everything because they're comparing their version 1 with like Instagram's version like 100. Like if you go in the App Store and look at the version that any of those big apps are on, it's on like hundreds of major versions and thousands or tens of thousands of minor versions. And I mean like 1.0.1, like the one at the beginning is called the major version. So it's major. I'll show you that real fast. In versioning, in computer science, there's typically, it's called, I forget what the official name for this syntax is, but it's very common, 1.0.1. So this first number is major, second one is minor, third one is patch. And so this is like major changes, this one is minor changes, and this is for fixing bugs. And if you make changes, you increment the number depending on what you change. So if you fixed a bug, you change this to 2. If you made a minor change to the application, you can increment this number. And when you increment or add 1 to this number resets to 0. So if I were to release a major patch, you would go 2.0.0 or something like that. Anyways, we won't go too off track here. This is MVP. Make sure you understand it so that you can build the actual most useful product for your users and reduce the load on yourself. You'd be very surprised at how few features you need to actually solve your user's problem. So be aware of this, incorporate it into your programming. Your life will be a lot easier and more straightforward. My name is Jameson Saunders. If you like videos like this, make sure to subscribe. Let me know what you thought in the comments below as well, and I will see you in the next video.